weekly show on U.S. foreign policy, and Medea Benjamin is co-hosting with me. We have a very important program tonight, Iran, what's next? And two guests will be with us. First guest is Negar Mortazavi, host of Iran podcast. Also, she is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. We also have Asal Rad, a great journalist who's been with us before, a scholar of Middle East history. So that's going to be exciting, and there's a lot to talk about with Iran, Israel, Lebanon, Gaza. First, though, I just wanted to ask all of you to stay until the end, because either in the middle or at the end, we're going to be calling the White House, well, excuse me, Congress. We're going to call Congress, and we're going to ask our House representatives to co-sponsor a bill to restore funding to UNRWA, right? I think the U.S. is the only country that suspended aid after these bogus allegations about UNRWA employees collaborating on October 7th to literally starve 2.3 million people in Gaza. We have 69 co-sponsors, but we want more, so please do stay with us for that. We also
Marcy, just a little correction there. There were a number of countries that cut off aid. We're the only ones that didn't resume the aid again.
That's right. That's what I meant to say. Okay. Also, we do have a letter, an Action Network letter. It's like one click, and you send it to your senators and your House representatives to say, no war, no attack on Iran. More to be discussed on that. First, let's go to Medea with some news updates.
Well, I just want to remind people they can say hello in the chat and tell us where you're from. It's great to see people coming from not only all over the country, but we often have people from different parts of the world. I want to update on a couple of things. One is a letter that Congressman McGovern initiated, which says that Israel should allow U.S. and international journalists into Gaza. We know the horrors of so many of the journalists in Gaza being killed, and Israel is the one killing them. And then Israel turns around and says, oh, we can't let these international journalists in because it's too dangerous. So there is a letter that came out in the New York Times in July, signed by 73 major news organizations, left, right, in the middle, whatever, all saying, we know the risks of war. We've often sent people into war zones. We want the right to be able to go into Gaza. And so we have been pushing that letter, and it's a little hard because Congress is on recess, so it's not as easy for the staff to contact the Congress people. Nevertheless, I think by now we have over 40 members of Congress who have signed it, and we have 2 more days. Well, we have tomorrow is the last day, actually, by end of day tomorrow. So if any of you want to be contacting your congressperson on that, it's the McGovern letter to let journalists into Gaza. And then we have another very interesting project that we have been supporting this week in Congress. There is a woman, a very active woman in she's from the Bethlehem area. Her name is Amira Musallam, and she has been in the United States this week. Last week she was at the UN. This week she's in DC, pushing for a support for a nonviolent peace force. They're called Unarmed Civil Protection, to get 100 of them sent to the West Bank. And she is working with a guy some of you might have heard of, Mel Duncan. He used to be the head of Nonviolent Peace Force. He's now retired. And in his retirement, he is doing this very big, wonderful project. So we have been going around with them in Congress trying to explain the actions of these violent settlers and how important it is to have outside international observers playing this accompaniment role. So that is something that you will hear more about in the future, but we were we feel very privileged to be part of the push for that.
And Medea, if you have a link or any information you want to post in the chat about the letter to let journalists cover what's happening, this Holocaust, that would be helpful. If not, Grace Siegelman, who's navigating the tech for us and is very active these days with CODEPINK disruptions, and she's going to share a little bit about that. She can send out some information about that letter tomorrow. At least you can ask your House rep in the morning or your senator in the morning to sign on to it. So a couple of other things on the international front. We know that Biden had a 30-minute conversation with Netanyahu last week. We now know that Biden is sending 100 U.S. troops to Israel to operate this, quote, air defense system that's supposed to protect Israel should Iran send missiles into Israel, which nobody expects to happen unless Israel attacks Iran. So all the more reason that we need to get those letters to our House representatives. We also know that Spain and France are calling for an arms embargo on Israel, but the biggest suppliers of arms, number one, the United States, and number two, Germany, still sending those weapons. And Biden is saying, Netanyahu, unless you let some aid in, unless you start feeding these people, we're going to withhold. We'll give you 30 days to send water, food, and medicine in. And after 30 days, if you don't, then we may not give you any more weapons. People don't have 30 days to wait. This is a catastrophe. This is a tragedy. This is genocide. So we really need to be in the offices of our House members, of our U.S. senators during this congressional recess. Grace, would you be up for sharing some of what you've been doing on Capitol Hill and beyond?
You say me?
Yeah, you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about what we did on Sunday. So I am based in Chicago, Illinois. I've lived here my entire life. And recently we had Hillary Clinton and Senator Tammy Duckworth come to the Auditorium Theater, which is right downtown. I've been going there since I was a little girl. And they were doing a book tour for Hillary's new book. And they were just shocked to see that we had to come to their book tour event and make our presence known and remind them that Tammy Duckworth has not listened to us for years now, as has Hillary Clinton. And in Chicago, you are always going to get a nice warm welcome when you're a war criminal. So myself and 8 other disruptors went into the Auditorium Theater and in order did like a bunch of different disruptions while we were in there. And then we had a rally outside, just explaining and exemplifying that Tammy Duckworth has taken over $700,000 from AIPAC throughout her career. And Hillary Clinton has said some terrible things recently about Gaza and about Palestine, saying that it's the Palestinians that are perpetuating the cycle of violence. And when we disrupted and when we called them out for this, Tammy Duckworth said, no, no, no. Come to me about your problems. Don't come to Hillary Clinton. Come to me instead. When she knows, and she knows that we know, that she blocks us every single day from going into her office and demanding that she calls for an end to aid to Israel, to not just perpetuate, not just fund, but to murder Palestinians. The U.S. is not just complicit, but they are an antagonizer in this genocide. So I'll quickly show my portion of this disruption right now. So let me share my screen for you guys. Organizers and allies just disrupted Hillary Clinton and Senator Tammy Duckworth at a book event for Hillary Clinton's newest book. We have been disrupting Tammy Duckworth forever now here in Chicago. She never listens to us. She never gives the time of day. And today was no different. They were talking about healthcare and family care for mothers here in the United States. very concerned about feminism, very concerned about making sure that women feel empowered here in the United States. Only for Tammy Duckworth to sign off on millions of dollars in aid to go to Israel to get in her pockets over $700,000 in pro-Israel lobby money. We had about 8 disruptors go in and disrupt, talking about how feminism cannot be co-opted by imperialism, by the war machine, and there are no feminist bombs, there are no feminist genocidal wars against Palestine and Lebanon, and the people of Chicago will not stand for it. And Tammy Duckworth, who has the largest Palestinian constituency in the entire United States. And they were just talking about family support, child care, health care for working mothers, sisters, fathers, brothers, and to do that over a year of genocide, when a year of genocide is just passed, not to mention 76 years of resistance and rebellion against an apartheid state, to be talking about this. We're not talking exactly what you said. He needs health care. He needs family care. He needs child care. And she is Tammy Duckworth and Hillary Clinton, while she was elected official, was putting that money in the pockets of Israel.
Good work, Grace. And I heard that there was another Code Pink action this week. I think we might have some video of that as well. Here we go.
Here we are at the Lincoln Memorial. They put out a trail of blood. At the top it says, "The streets of Palestine are covered with blood." These are to represent the murdered bodies of Palestinians.
Yes.
Who you represent? What is your sign for?
Came out 7 months old, murdered on May 14th, 2021, represents thousands of children who've been killed by Israel with U.S. weapons. It's our government. Like 70% of them. So it's very likely that it was the U.S. bomb that killed this. I do anything for my feeling. I don't know what to do. I'm just kids. They cry every day. See all of the kids around me? They're just kids. Why wouldn't you just send a missile to them and kill them?
News telling lies, check the facts that they cover. Cause my people out here crying, or they dying, or they suffer. And just notice for my people up in Gaza and Ramallah, and it's free Palestine until it's backwards, motherfucker. I'ma speak for my people, fuck this rap shit. Forcing children out their homes when they ain't have shit.
All right, thank you. Our first guest is with us now, and Medea will introduce her.
Okay, I am so sorry to hear that Negar is not feeling well, but thank you so much for joining us in any case. And we are delighted to have you on here, especially with the very precarious situation right now with Iran. Negar Mortazawi is an award-winning journalist and commentator, editor and host of the Iran podcast, and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy based in Washington, D.C. She's been covering Iranian and Middle Eastern affairs, as well as U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East for over a decade. She received her master's degree from Brandeis and her bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts. She grew up in Iran and Germany, immigrated to the United States in 2002, and has been living in exile since 2009. We're so grateful to you for joining us. Thank you so much, Negar.
Thanks for having me, Medea, Marcy, and everyone. Thanks for hosting, for having this conversation. As you're saying, timely conversation in a very critical time. and I'm happy to be here. I don't know if Asa will join us also, but I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, she'll be with us probably in another 10 minutes or so. Maybe you can just give us your assessment of the level of threat and danger that we're facing in terms of a regional war.
Well, I would say we already are seeing the regional war. Basically, the war that started in Gaza has spread only in the past year into multiple fronts. Now, Israel is also going into Lebanon in the northern front. The Red Sea, the conflict with the Houthis has only continued in the past year in the Red Sea, skirmishes with the militias in Iraq, and now potentially expanding the war to Iran, a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. I think the threat is very high. Like I said, the war has only expanded and spread in the past year, and now we're hearing more and more voices, even from inside Israel, that suggest that Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't seem to want to stop the war. It seems like expanding the war is something that is directly tied to also his political future, and a potential direct confrontation with Iran would eventually have to drag the United States into a war, which would be catastrophic for the region. If we learned anything from Iraq and Afghanistan, is that these endless wars in the Middle East have no good ending. And I think a war with Iran would be much more devastating, larger, and more destructive than, let's say, for example, Iraq, which is a smaller country, smaller population, in a very different situation. So I think we're at a crossroad when it comes to this conflict. This is another crossroad that can see sort of a tit for tat, Iran, Israel back and forth, as we saw in April when the Israelis attacked the Iranian consulate in Syria. The Iranians retaliated by attacking Israeli soil, and then the Israelis retaliated by attacking Iran, and they both sort of took an off ramp, and that didn't escalate into a major confrontation. This time around, I think, again, we're at a major crossroad of this war. It can become a watershed moment to bring the war to the next level. It could also be something to be contained at the level that is, and not really explode into a full-on conflict between the two countries. And I'll just say this and stop, but I think the role of the United States is more crucial than ever. Over the past year, I would say, in the war against Palestinians and the attacks on Gaza, and now even Israel's incursion into Lebanon, they seem to have had unconditional support from the United States. Maybe some criticism here and there publicly, but really unconditional support for the war. But with Iran, I would say the Biden administration's position has been different. I think this is an area where they've been careful, that they wanted to avoid a direct confrontation with Iran. In April, they made it clear to the Israelis that they would support them only in defense. When the Iranians attacked, they helped them intercept missiles and drones, but that they wouldn't participate in an offense, in the offensive from the Israelis on Iran. And I think that's what helped sort of avert that situation from expanding, and kept it contained to that status quo. Now we're hearing different reports and analysis coming from inside the administration, so it's a critical and worrying time.
Medea, if you have a question, jump in.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'll ask.
Sure. Negar, I think, the sense is that Iran has been very patient and measured in its responses so far, trying to focus on military bases, trying not to kill civilians or to kill anyone, it seems. And how much is there a backlash within Iran from the right against the measures, and how much is this putting pressure on the new president, Pezeshkian, who ran on a platform of reaching out to the West?
Right, Medea, you're absolutely right that Iran has also shown restraint in avoiding or preventing a full-on war and conflict or a conflict with Israel and obviously with the United States. I would say even that April episode, because the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria was a lethal attack. Number of Iranian commanders and forces were killed, and it was an attack on a diplomatic building in Syria. So Iran saw that as crossing a major red line for them, even in the context of that shadow war that's been ongoing between Iran and Israel. But the response, as you said, was mostly designed as a warning shot. They telegraphed that they were going to retaliate beforehand, and then they sort of tipped off the other side through mediators in the United States that they were going to attack, and essentially allowed for the US and other allies of Israel to be able to intercept and sort of minimize the damage or prevent casualties. This time around, also the attack in October, which was a retaliation for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, the Hamas political chief, which Iran saw as an attack on its sovereignty. And then also the assassination of the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, in Beirut, together with, this is something that isn't always reported in or seen in the headlines, he was assassinated together with an Iranian commander, Nil Furushan. And so the combination of these attacks is something that Iran retaliated for, even though, as you said, Pezeshkian, the new president, the reformist president, who has tried to talk about diplomacy, engagement with the United States, resolving conflicts through peace. It's put him in a very difficult position. When he came to New York to the UN, it was before the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, but it was after Ismail Haniyeh. Ismail Haniyeh actually was in Tehran for his inauguration, and he was killed on the first day of Pezeshkian's presidency. And one of the points that Pezeshkian was making in the meetings and briefings was that they haven't yet retaliated for the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, and that's something very difficult. Essentially, that they've shown a lot of restraint for their own armed forces and the hardliners inside to wait and not retaliate and see if they can use diplomacy to come to some form of a ceasefire. Iran did communicate that they were looking for a ceasefire in Gaza, and that if a ceasefire happens, they wouldn't retaliate. Well, a ceasefire didn't happen, and then more assassinations came and the incursion into Lebanon. So I think it's put not just Pezeshkian, but the reformists as a whole in diplomacy in general into a box, into a very difficult position, because in order to have successful diplomacy and engagement, you need a partner on the other side. And I think the problem with the Pezeshkian presidency now is, again, timing in the United States. He won the election and rose to power and presidency just before the US election, and there doesn't seem to be any appetite in Washington, in the United States, for any form of diplomacy and engagement with Iran. So I think we're going to see this conflict mode continue, and the diplomats can't really save us until the US election happens, and then things will become more clear after that, which is just around the corner.
Yes, and what I'm reading is that there's an expectation that Israel will retaliate in the next 3 weeks. Biden has reportedly told Netanyahu, you cannot strike Iran's nuclear facilities or its oil installations. I don't know where that leaves us. It's pretty frightening sending US troops over there to operate these weapons systems. I mean, we certainly don't want to see this escalate.
Yes, so initially the talk was to attack Iran's nuclear sites, which is something that the Netanyahu government has actually been talking about and pushing. Essentially, they wanted the US to do this attack, and they've been pushing for this for almost 2 decades now, publicly and privately. And then I think the Biden administration and the president himself, they sort of put that as a signal that that's off limits. And there were talks of attacking oil fields, which Iran is one of the largest producers of oils in the region. And so attacking Iranian oil fields and exports could disrupt the market, potentially impact oil prices for everyone. And so I think that also became off limits. And now the latest reporting we saw yesterday and today was that they're talking about attacking military sites, military targets. Now, what does that mean? It's a very broad, general, and vague description. So military targets near civilian targets, without civilian casualties. What kind of collateral are we talking about? So I think if it's some kind of a reciprocal attack that creates some kind of damage, but not so much casualties that the Iranians can stomach, this may become they can sort of take the off ramp both sides and get out of this new cycle. But if it's a major attack, depending on which site, how much casualties they're causing, I think the Iranians are signaling that they're prepared to retaliate and attack again.
And Iran has what, 80 million people?
80 million people, much larger than Iraq. The central government is a lot stronger. This is not Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
Most of the
20 years
people
ago.
under 30
It's
are
certainly
under
a
35.
very
Yeah.
different.
Most of the people under 35.
35, 40, so a young population. And I would say the population is very critical of the government. They have a lot of grievances, but nevertheless, sovereignty and national unity is something that has a deep root in Iran, and we don't really see an appetite among big portions of the population welcoming an attack or invasion or boots on the ground. So I think it's just going to be another very devastating situation, as other endless wars in the Middle East have shown us. And to be clear, I don't think that that's something the Biden administration is looking for. They certainly know that this is not something they want, but you may not want to enter a war, but you can nevertheless sleepwalk or be dragged into or stumble upon a conflict. And then when you're at a point of no return, then it's just cycles of escalation from there.
Reminds me of Vietnam. Well, thank you so much, Negar, for joining us, particularly when you're not feeling, 100%, but we really learned so much from you and appreciate your presence. You're welcome to stick around for more questions or take a rest, whatever's best for you. And
I can stay a little longer if you want. I'm happy to take a few questions. I'm gonna roll now. I apologize for the voice.
How about this? We introduce Asal. She speaks for a little while, and then we have the two of you on, and both can take the questions. All right?
Okay, sure.
Wonderful. Our next guest, Dr. Asal Rod, is a scholar of Middle East history. She works on research and writing related to U.S. foreign policy issues, the Middle East, and contemporary Iran. Her writing can be seen in Newsweek, The National Interest, The Independent, Foreign Policy, and more. And she's appeared as a commentator on BBC World, Al Jazeera, CNN, and NPR. Dr. Asal Rod completed a PhD in history from the University of California at Irvine in 2018. She is the author of The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. Welcome, Dr. Asal Rod, to CODEPINK Congress.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcy, for having me. And I'm sorry I had to join late, but I'm glad I got a little bit of Negar's comments, which are always very insightful.
Yes, so please share with us your analysis of where this might be going and what people can do to try to reverse course.
Well, because I joined a little late, I don't want to sort of be repetitive on what Negar was saying. I guess in terms of, the question, I know the question is always, where is this going? And as a historian, I hate answering that question because I don't know. Like, that's the reality, right? The very real answer is, and it's not that I specifically don't know, nobody knows. I think that's one of the biggest frustrations in listening to sort of commentators and analysts when they talk about a situation, the tension that right now exists in the region, like it's a game, especially when you're so far away, when you're on another continent across the world. It seems like you're just talking about, well, maybe this is the damage that's done, or maybe this many people are killed, as if these are not real people with real lives, and we don't have the potential of creating an actual catastrophe. I think that's, on one hand, I don't want to be an alarmist, and I want to look at the situation and say, well, what we have seen is a lot of restraint on the Iranian side and just regionally, right? Aside from Israel itself, every other actor in the region has been quite restrained in their reaction to what is going on. As an example of that, when you look at, for instance, the way that the current invasion of Lebanon is framed in the United States by the Biden administration, they make it sound like, you would think, if you just listen to them, you would think that Hezbollah has been firing rockets into Israel every day, overwhelmingly on the Hezbollah side, right? Like cross-border attacks. You would assume that if not most of them, minimally half of those attacks would have been carried out by Hezbollah. That's not the reality on the ground. The reality is that over 80% of cross-border attacks over the last year between Hezbollah and Israel have been carried out by Israel. So, one could argue Israel is the aggressor in that situation. You would if it was the other way around. Anybody would. The other argument that you hear when it comes to Lebanon specifically is that Hezbollah just, sort of randomly on October 8th decided to attack Israel completely unprovoked. This completely leaves out the context of Gaza and the fact that there were already bombs raining down on Gaza by that time. So these are the ways that things are framed. If you look at Iran, when Iran is talked about, it is discussed as this, not only a nuclear threat, despite the fact that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons and Israel is the country that has nuclear weapons, but on top of that, it's as if it's this sort of fanatical state that is ideologically bound to extinguishing Israel from the map. In reality, if you look at the actions of these states over the last year, one state, Israel, has quite literally erased Palestine from the map altogether, right? When Netanyahu shows maps of Israel, Gaza and the West Bank have been erased from those maps. And this predates October 7th. When you look at what is happening in Gaza, they are trying to basically erase Gaza from existence. That is not what's happening on the Iranian side. But this is the way that everything is sort of framed. So in terms of what we can do and where we're going, we're relying on the rest of the region to be restrained while we're allowing Israel to do whatever it wants in the region. So what we have to do, if we're Americans, and I'm sure everybody here has been trying to do, is put pressure on this on the US, which is not, which is centrally responsible for what is happening. Because without US aid, without US weapons, without US support, Israel could not carry out the atrocities that they are carrying out on a daily basis. So the impetus is on us to put pressure on this administration to basically stop it. It's a unique situation because in a lot of conflicts, there isn't, right now, the US could not as easily, I should say, stop the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But it can very easily do so in the case of Israel because we already know all the other actors in the region are trying to avoid a large-scale war, are trying to avoid that. And the one actor that has to be contained is Israel. And the one entity that is providing Israel the means to continue expanding the war is the United States. And I had heard a little bit about what Negar was saying in terms of what could happen from here. Obviously, we're all awaiting the Israeli retaliation to an Iranian retaliation, which is precisely what happened in April, right? This is, again, it's presented to us as, well, Israel has the right to defend itself and it is retaliating against an Iranian aggression. Whereas the Iranian aggression was also a retaliation because Iran also has the right to defend itself. But that's never something that is talked about. Negar mentioned that this was a retaliation for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. That's a violation of Iranian sovereignty. Just consider for a moment if any country had assassinated Netanyahu, who is a war criminal, while he was in New York. Would that be a violation of US sovereignty? Of course. unquestionably it would be considered a violation of US sovereignty. It's the same even when it's the sovereignty of a country or a government that is an adversary. Nonetheless, the legal system that protects sovereignty still exists. So if the response now from Israel can be contained to something limited like we saw in April, Iran is very likely not to respond again because they have tried to avoid a full confrontation. And if we're basing our predictions on precedent, that would be the precedent. But if Israel attacks nuclear facilities or oil facilities or significant infrastructure in that way, it causes civilian casualties. All of that changes the calculation from the Iranian side. And we've seen a little bit of the Biden administration sort of, I don't want to use the word pressure because I find it ridiculous. They're not doing anything, very much of anything. If they wanted to pressure Israel, they could. But at least rhetorically, you hear them saying, Israel should avoid oil facilities as well as nuclear facilities. We'll see if the behind the scenes pressure that they always talk about that we don't see actually bears fruit.
So we've got, unfortunately, Negar had to leave because she really is not feeling well. And we've got lots of questions for you, Asal. So I'll start out maybe the first ones about the Iran's capability to quickly develop a nuclear weapon. I always was confused whether the fatwa against nuclear weapons was something real or not. Whether Iran was indeed always trying to get a nuclear weapon or now knows that it better have a nuclear weapon. Where do you feel that that stands now? And why is it that that Israel is told the US will not help it to attack Iran's nuclear facilities and it can't do it on its own? And if that is indeed the case, why won't the US help them bomb Iran's nuclear facilities?
So Iran's nuclear program predates the Islamic Republic and the Revolution of 1979. I believe it's actually the US that helped the last Shah, the monarchy, begin their nuclear program. According to, and then after the revolution, it was sort of abandoned for a period of time, and it was resumed because most of the modernizing projects that the monarchy was undertaking with the Islamic Republic continued as well. And so what US intelligence says is that Iran had experimented with like a weaponized program back in 2003. And since you brought up the fatwa is actually from 2003. So US intelligence says the last time Iran had any kind of work that they were doing that could be the weaponization of their program was back in 2003. The latest US intelligence, and by latest I mean like last week or in the last few days, is still that there is no evidence that Iran is currently pursuing a weapon or to weaponize their program. Now, 2003 is also when they abandoned the sort of weaponized side, is when you get the fatwa from the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. It's also when the US invades Iraq based on the idea of weapons of mass destruction, right? So you could also see strategically why it would make sense for a country like Iran to say, we're going to abandon this because we don't want to be the next target of the United States. And so the fatwa, on one hand, has legitimacy. I wouldn't say that it's meaningless, right? It has some legitimacy. At the same time, if Iran's government was to sort of calculate that it actually makes more sense for them in terms of their national security interest to weaponize, then that fatwa would very likely be lifted, right? It's a religious edict. And so while on one hand, there is the reality of the moral imperative not to have nuclear weapons, on the other hand, what you typically see is that national security interests trump everything else. So now the question is, what would create that calculation for Iran? The irony is it's basically US policies, right? If Iran wanted a nuclear weapons program, they would not have agreed to unprecedented oversight of their nuclear program through the Iran nuclear deal or the JCPOA, right? The JCPOA as far as non-proliferation experts are concerned, was a landmark agreement because there was never that much oversight over anybody's nuclear program. It basically made the path to an Iranian bomb impossible. Now, what has happened with the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration, the Biden admin basically maintaining that, and now the current situation, the thoughts in Iranian society are starting to shift because predominantly Iranians have been against having a nuclear weapon as well. But they're starting to think this is the only deterrence we can have, because right now you have a situation where Israel has a very, very clear military advantage, not only in their conventional military, but the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran does not. You can see, I mean, just logically, we can all see where this notion of deterrence comes from. The only way for Iran to protect itself from an Israeli nuclear weapon is if they have one themselves that they can retaliate with. Where the current program exists and there's this phrase that the Obama administration adopted, which made everything very confusing for people, called breakout time. And breakout time makes it sound like the amount of time before they have a nuclear weapon. What breakout time actually means is the amount of time it would take for them to have the nuclear material needed to build a weapon, which are two very different things. Because while they might be weeks away from having enough nuclear material, they're likely, this is according, I'm not an arms expert at all, but according to arms experts, it would take 1 to 2 years likely for them to actually have a weapon. Because not only do you have to build the weapon, you have to have a delivery system for that weapon. You have to test those weapons. So it's not they're weeks away from a bomb. It's they're maybe weeks away from having enough material for it. And the only reason that is the case is because the United States abrogated the deal that they co-signed in 2015, which is when Iran, actually, it's not even, I was about to say it's when Iran started to expand its program. Iran stayed in compliance with the nuclear deal after the US abrogated the deal, right? After the US quit the deal, for a full year, Iran maintained all of its obligations under the deal. It was only after they got none of the benefits for it, right? Once maximum pressure and sanctions basically meant that Iran was giving what they had promised, but not getting anything, that they finally started to take calculated decisions to expand their program.
So just one final part of that question that I had asked was, why doesn't the U.S. want to help Iran to attack their nuclear facilities? I mean, help Israel.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding me of that part. Sorry about that. Well, so the idea, one of the things that Iran has sort of threatened is Iran is a party to the NPT, right, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, unlike Israel. If their nuclear facilities are attacked, then they have threatened in the past to basically pull out of the NPT and weaponize and decide to go from a civilian nuclear program to a weapons program. Because what Iran now has the knowledge, right? This is one of the things that Israel tried to prevent by assassinating their scientists. For years, Iranian scientists were assassinated, these are civilians, on Iranian soil by Israel. Of course, that's not how it works. You can't undo knowledge, right? You can't eradicate ideas and knowledge. And I say you can't eradicate ideas because Israel tries to do that too, but you cannot get rid of them with violence. And so the knowledge is there for Iran. It is a political decision. They're choosing not to have a weapon or weaponized program. And that choice, the US would run the risk of that choice being different if they especially if the US participates in attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. But that's why you see the Biden administration trying to tell Israel, don't attack the nuclear facilities, because that could be the spark that makes the decision in not only the Iranian government, but something that the Iranian public may accept as well, to weaponize and then set off an arms race in the region.
Dr. Asal Rod is with us on CODEPINK Congress. I'm Marcy Winograd, co-hosting with Medea Benjamin. Just reminding everybody to please stay with us. We will be calling Capitol Hill to ask our members of the House to co-sponsor a bill to restore UNRWA funding. We want you to please sign the letter to Congress, No War with Iran. And here we go. It's right there in the chat. Okay, Dr. Rod. What about the fact that we have, I don't know, about 43,000 troops in the Middle East, 19 military bases? Isn't that a deterrent for the Biden administration not to collaborate with Israel in attacking Iran? I mean, it seems like our troops are at great risk.
Absolutely. Actually, the Pentagon had a press briefing today and was basically asked very similar question, right? By now sending the THAAD anti-missile system with 100 US troops to operate it, aren't we putting our troops in direct danger? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, we absolutely are. Not only those 100 troops that are going directly into Israel, but also all US personnel and military assets in the region, because the problem at this point is this is not an Israeli war. This is a US-Israeli war. I mean, we can keep calling it Israel's war, but when the US has played the role that it has, whether it's, I mean, even kinetically, right? When there was the attacks in April and the recent attacks in October, the US stepped in to actually intercept many of those missiles. If it's putting military assets in the region, if it's putting boots on the ground, if it's putting billions of dollars in weapons and military aid, we're already in it, right? So to describe it any other way is sort of misleading, but how deep in it is only the question that we have now, right? How entrenched are we? You're sending 100 troops, that's very different than saying, hey, we're about to send 100,000 troops, right? These are very different situations. But what's interesting to me is that you have an administration that repeatedly, I mean, you have Joe Biden repeatedly telling Donald Trump, his predecessor, that you do not have the authority without the authorization of Congress to take this country to war. You do not have the authority to do that. Now, technically, Trump didn't take us to war, but what Biden was arguing is that Trump's actions were still needed to be authorized. When the Trump administration was carrying out bombings in other countries, this was something that Biden said as a candidate. And now here he is as president, sending boots on the ground to Israel in the middle of a conflict. That is not that clearly puts American soldiers at risk without any authorization to do so.
Well, that leads into another question that I've been seeing a couple of them in the chat, which is about what would happen if Trump is elected. He's threatened to blow Iran to smithereens. And a related question in there has been about Iran's relationship with Russia. They said that Pezeshkian met with Putin recently. And so if you could kind of weave those two things together.
Well, so I'm going to try to answer the Trump question because it's becoming, I was personally a huge critic of the Trump administration, both for their domestic and foreign policy. And I caveat that because I'm having a very, very difficult time in terms of foreign policy understanding how Trump would be worse. That's just my honest opinion. I don't know. First of all, I don't know what's worse than genocide. I don't know what's worse than that. I don't think we have, gradations of genocide. I mean, once we facilitated a genocide, I'm pretty sure we've gone as far as you can go in terms of foreign policy. Right now, under this administration, we have a very high risk of full-scale war between Israel and Iran, and potentially now drawing in the United States. Under this administration, we are at a risk of not allowing Iran, but basically, in a certain way, forcing Iran into a position where they calculate that a nuclear weapon makes sense. So now you have that nuclear issue in the region, as well as you have Ukraine and Russia and the threat of nuclear war there, right? So you have a really horrific situation in terms of US foreign policy under this administration. So when, Trump uses the rhetoric of, I will destroy Iran, I don't see, if I look at the Trump presidency and compare it to the Biden administration in terms of foreign policy and global conflict and war, we're much worse off right now than we were under Trump. That's not something I say happily. It's a sort of frustration of, I don't really know how either of these parties is going to approach anything. What I will say actually is I would give Trump the edge in this particular case. I see him as being more anti-war at this point, based on what's happened. That could change, but up until now, you can make a very reasonable argument that he's more anti-war than Joe Biden is. And by extension, Kamala Harris, because for whatever reason, Kamala Harris does not have any desire to distinguish herself from Joe Biden, which is another sort of bizarre thing. Now, this connects to your question about Russia and Iran because it's a foreign policy question, right? Part of the reason you have a country like Iran aligning more with Russia is the fact that their attempts to engage with the Western world failed, completely failed. And it didn't fail because they did something. It failed because the US decided, no, it's not enough. You come to the table, you negotiate a deal, you abide by that deal, we're still not going to do it. And so that was a huge defeat for moderate and reformist voices in Iran, because basically the hardliners, right, the ones who never wanted to engage with the West or the US were vindicated. They said, this is exactly what we told you. They're not trustworthy. And unfortunately, that's precisely what happened. You could see it again in this right before, in September of 2023, there was a prisoner exchange between the Biden administration and Iran, right? The US and Iran. And part of what Iran was supposed to get from that is to be allowed to use their own money in a Qatari bank to make purchases of essential goods only. And that would have to be approved, that Iran would not even be able to do it themselves. It would be facilitated. Guess what the Biden administration did? They reneged on that promise as well. So you have these repeated situations where the US reneges on these promises, and this emboldens hardliners in Iran because they continuously say, we told you so. Like, you cannot trust these people. So what happens? They pivot east. They go towards countries like China, they go towards countries like Russia, they pivot towards their own region. And that's why you see a lot of the diplomatic work that's been done in the last several years in Iran has focused not on the US and the Western world, but it's focused the other way. On top of that, the US abuses its sanctions power to a point where now you see the global South try and counter that power with organizations like BRICS, which includes a country like Russia, and now Russia, China, and later invited Iran. So they're gravitating towards each other because the US is not allowing any space for actual engagement or diplomacy with any of these countries. And where there is diplomacy, the US has reneged on those deals.
So can I just push back a little on the Trump part? Because I see some people pushing back in the chat saying it was Trump who pulled out of the nuclear deal. Couldn't Trump join with Israel and attack Iran's facilities? Couldn't the US use a nuclear weapon against Iran? Couldn't it be much worse?
It could. And that's why I tried to caveat with, I'm not saying this as a fan of Trump. I'm saying I usually try to be optimistic, but I'm just not. I think that's my frustration, is I have no optimism for any of them. Trump, what I will say about Donald Trump and the difference between, again, Trump and the Biden admin is he himself he doesn't have any kind of political ideology. That's just the reality of it. Like, he's not a politician. He certainly doesn't have a foreign policy position. So he is very much influenced by the people around him, right? By his advisors. And if you look at his administration, Rex Tillerson was his initial Secretary of State. And under Tillerson, the US stayed in the deal. The US stayed in the deal and certified it on more than one occasion. it was within 2 weeks of when he changed his Secretary of State to Mike Pompeo, who is an evangelical Zionist, who said God had brought Trump, or agreed with the idea, I should say, that God had brought Trump to defend Israel from Iran. Like, this is the level of ideological thinking that we were dealing with. That's when the US withdrew from the deal and took a very hardline position against Iran. In fact, there was, I forget the year in which this occurred, but Trump, as you saw the way that he, for instance, treated North Korea, Trump wanted to have a meeting with Iran's president, Rouhani, when they were all at some function, I believe, in Europe. He himself, because he doesn't have political thinking, just wants a deal. He wants to be able to say, I got a better deal than Barack Obama. That's what he wants. I'm not, again, to be perfectly clear, I am not saying that Trump will be better. What I am saying is these options are all terrible, but what a frightening situation we exist in where Trump might be better. That's how bad this administration has handled it. And that is the point that I'm making. Not that Trump could be better, that he will be, but that we can even entertain the logic that he could be is a reflection of just how bad this administration has been.
Marcy, you're on mute.
Particularly when you see Kamala Harris parading around with Liz Cheney and expressing pride in having Dick Cheney's endorsement. I think Trump wants the Nobel Peace Prize. That's what I think. But, here we are. And the key is people have said, hey, what do we do? How, what can we do on a daily basis? And I think a lot of us are doing what we have to do. We are in our Congress members' offices. We are aligning ourselves, showing solidarity with the students who are risking a lot at the universities. Some of them graduate students who are withholding their labor from the military contractors. We saw, I don't know, was it 1,000 or more members of Jewish Voice for Peace and allies on Wall Street yesterday, shutting down Wall Street. So there's no one answer, but we have to just continue and be louder. I really want to thank you, Dr. Assalrad, for joining us on CODEPINK Congress. You are such an amazing scholar of Middle East history and journalist, and we're really grateful that you joined us. And this will mark the end of our recorded session.
Hey, Marcy, let me just say that people should follow Assal on Twitter. Her tweets are brilliant. They get hundreds of thousands of likes. I don't know how you do it, Assal, but it's really good. So make sure that you follow her.
Yes, and if you're on the live stream or watching on the live stream, you can look out for an email in the days to follow with more information about this program. So let's unmute and thank Dr. Assalrad.
Thank you.